Okay, so the theme that I derived from the stimulus packet was the passing down of traditions, and this connects to my topic, relationship-related evolutionary psychology behaviors, in that the whole idea of evolution is that selected genes are getting passed down. So evolutionary psychology is essentially looking at universal human behaviors and asking, okay, which of these were either created or affected by evolution? So I'm only going to be looking at two behaviors today, one of which is kin selection, which is just prioritizing your own kin, looking at relationships between family members, and my proposal for what the evolutionary purpose of kin selection is to get our genes passed along. And then the second behavior that I'm looking at is signaling, which is what it sounds like. It's in one organism signaling some feature about itself to another organism or organisms. One really good example of this is brightly colored insects, essentially telling their predators, you don't want to eat me, I don't taste too good. And my proposal for what the evolutionary purpose of signaling is just to signal your worth to potential relationship partners, romantic or otherwise. So I got my evidence about kin selection in plants, which you'll see where this is going in a few slides, but I got my evidence about kin selection in plants from a source in the stimulus packet, Secret Life of Plants. And there were a couple studies I was looking at, but the one that I thought was the most robust was the following. So when you put two different species of plants next to each other, they have no qualms, if I'm going to be personifying these plants, they have no qualms about spreading their roots and stealing nutrients from their neighbor. However, when you put two plants of the same species next to each other, they refrain from spreading their roots. In other words, they could be stealing nutrients from their neighbor, but they're not, even though it would benefit themselves to do so. And the reasoning for this is that kin selection exists. So my argument, it was a pretty succinct one, went as following. If you see a behavior showing up across species, it's likely due to evolution. And the two species that I discussed in my essay were one, apes, because they're closely related to us, easy to understand, and they're proven to exhibit kin selection in varying degrees. And then the reason plants were so important are because they're undisputably, they do not have emotions, they do not have consciousness. They are like the furthest from human that you can get, and yet they're still exhibiting the same behavior, which is even stronger evidence that evolution is a root cause. So now on to signaling. The behavior that I'm going to be talking about right now is conversation. So my claim is that conversation is used to signal your worth to potential partners. However, I was reading a book a while back called Elephant in the Brain, and they had a chapter on conversation. And right off the bat, they said, okay, but there is one counterclaim that is reasonable, at least on the surface, and that is that conversation is used to share information. Okay, but then they said, if this is the case, then the following three behaviors, the following three things would probably also be true. And those are, one, we would keep conversational debts. Two, we wouldn't need to stay on topic all the time. However, in actuality, that's clearly not the case. If I were to come up to you right now, Ainsley, okay, and talk about the rainy weather outside, and then abruptly switch to flathead screws, that would be abnormal. We use segues and transitions in everyday conversation. However, if the whole goal of conversation was to get in as much information as possible, those wastes of time would probably actually be discouraged. And then the third thing that would probably be true is small talk. Small talk would not exist, sorry. So these were three pretty solid, logically, refutations to the counterclaim, but they weren't evidence. So I incorporated the following study on our receptivity to information. And how the study went down was subjects were made to listen to a variety of lectures. A bunch of the lecture topics were distractions. The ones the researchers were paying attention to were pro-smoking, anti-smoking, pro-Christianity, and anti-Christianity. And then the subjects were told, sorry, these lectures were recorded on poor quality audio devices, so there's going to be static. And then here are the instructions as to how to get rid of the static if you so please. It wasn't a once and done instruction that you had to repeatedly, whenever the static came on, if you wanted to turn off the static, you had to repeat the instructions to make the static go away. And then after all this, The subjects were given surveys to fill out, and again, a bunch of the survey questions were distractions. The questions we care about are, do you smoke and do you go to church? And what the results showed was that smokers were less likely to turn off the static during anti-smoking lectures, just as churchgoers were less likely to turn off the static during anti-Christianity lectures. And what this tells us, we are only receptive to information that we want to hear. And it doesn't make sense that we would be evolved to converse. And conversation is fairly costly if you're looking at it. It's a big waste of time, time is a very valuable resource. So it wouldn't make sense that we would be evolved to repeatedly perform such a costly behavior if the whole goal was to share information and then if we were just going to be selective about what we heard. So these are just two behaviors that I looked at. I looked at multiple more in my essay, and those were just relationship-related ones. There is a long list of evolutionary psychology behaviors, things that we think of to be human and morally good, not all morally good, but kin selection, that's what's considered to be morally good. When there is reasonable evidence to support the idea that there may be ulterior motives for why we do what we do. And this is risky information to have. It's well accepted in psychology that we humans are self-deceptive creatures. We rely on lying to ourselves. So if we knew the reason behind every single little thing we did, we would probably not function as we're intended, as we're evolved to function. So then you arrive at this debate over ignorance. You can say, okay, we should keep this information kept quiet and everyone's going to keep working as they're supposed to work. Or you can say, let's make this information even more widely dispersed and risk, for lack of a better phraseology, screwing with the balance of nature, which is a pretty big risk to take. So I personally think that the former solution is the optimal one. However, I'd be a bit of a hypocrite if I put all my confidence into that answer, because I go around telling this information to anyone who will listen to me, as evidenced by this presentation. However, if I'm to be looking at it objectively, I do think ignorance is the best way to go.
Danny, what evidence did you gather that you didn't use, and why did you choose not to use it?
There was a stage where I knew I wanted to do something I wanted to look at evolutionary psychology, but I hadn't narrowed it down to relationship-related behaviors yet. So there was one big chunk of content, research, that I had about us being grossed out by stuff and the evolutionary role that plays into that behavior. And it didn't fit in because, it was sufficient evidence, but I needed a source from the stimulus packet, and I knew I was going to use the plants one, which was undoubtedly having to do with kin selection. And the only way I could figure out how to chunk in the majority of the research I'd done with kin selection was to look at relationship-related evolutionary psychology behaviors.
Nice. And what advice would you have for other researchers who consider this topic?
It doesn't apply just to evolutionary psychology or even to psychology as a whole. It is, I think, a little more important than psychology as a whole field, but to make sure, because studies can look like they're showing something and indeed not actually be true. You need to make sure that it's replicable, and not just the same exact identical study, but to vary it a little bit and make sure it still shows the same results. There was one phenomenon that was thought to have been true in psychology for a while, and then a couple of years ago was found to just be, it's true a little bit, but it's not really that prominent, and even when, it's called priming, and so you need to be careful with how you're performing your studies.